Were there people from other groups that went to Masada to seek refuge from?
Absolutely, there were absolutely, and so that's actually one of the most interesting things, which is that you have to understand that what happens is, so the revolt breaks out in 66, and then in 67 the Romans basically arrive in the country starting from north. They work their way south. In 68 CE, they're in the area of the Dead Sea, Jericho and Qumran, and basically the Roman strategy was to subdue all the rest of the country and isolate Jerusalem and leave Jerusalem for last, which is what they did, right? Pretty much. And so as the Romans are sort of, subduing the rest of the country, you have all of these Jewish refugees who were fleeing in advance, right, of the Romans coming. And that's how so many of them end up in Jerusalem in 70, right? So Jerusalem in 70 was swollen with refugees. And so you have this situation where all of these displaced people are fleeing in advance of the Roman attack and looking for places to secure themselves. And so undoubtedly, some of those, both before 70 and even after 70, were making their way south. And some of them made their way to Masada. And there's no doubt that, so Josephus says that at the time of the Roman siege, which occurred in the winter spring of 72-73 or 73-74, there's a debate about the chronology, but it occurred over that winter spring season, one winter spring season. Josephus says that at the time of the siege, there were 967 Jews holding out on top of Masada, but they were not 967 soldiers, and they were not 967 rebels. They were 967 men, women, and children. And so these were like basically families. Some of them were members of the Sicarii, but others were just, refugee families who had found refuge on top of Masada. And there's, I think, pretty good evidence that among these sort of groups of refugees who arrived at Masada were members of the Qumran community. Qumran is the site where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. I agree with a majority of scholars that the group that lived there were Essenes. And there's some pretty good evidence that some members of that community were among the Jews on top of Masada at the time of the siege. And they must have fled from Qumran when the Romans destroyed Qumran in 68. So probably some of them made their way south to Masada. And the evidence consists of both literary and archaeological evidence. By literary, I mean, well, it's kind of literary. By literary, I mean that there are scrolls that were found in Yadin's excavations on top of Masada, which, although not definitely sectarian, meaning they're not definitely works of this particular sect, are works that are found among the Dead Sea Scrolls and are compatible with a sectarian outlook. And so the Joshua Apocryphon, the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, for example. And it was on that basis, by the way, the discovery of the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice at Qumran, at Masada, that Yadin himself suggested that some members of the Qumran community were among those on top of Masada at the time of the siege. Since then, some of the pottery from Yadin's excavations has been published, and it turns out that we have among the pottery from Masada a small number of examples of the very distinctive cylindrical jars with bowl-shaped lids that are found in the dozens at Qumran and in the surrounding caves, but for all intents and purposes, nowhere else. And so in my mind, that really supports the sort of literary evidence. And I agree with Yadin. Now, there are very eminent scholars who disagree with that view. For example, my colleague, the late Kenan argued that, works like the Joshua Apocryphon and the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice would have circulated more generally among the Jewish population, which is certainly correct, and therefore do not necessarily indicate sectarian presence at Qumran. But I think that the totality of the evidence together supports the view that some members of that community were on top of Masada.